I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. Are you confused about all the contradictions about COVID-19? Where do we turn for accurate information? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Dr. Eric Topol is one of the most cited researchers in medicine. He'll offer his analysis of COVID-19 variants, treatments, and challenges.
Will oral antiviral medicines change the trajectory of the pandemic? What about the cost? When a medication is developed with federal support, should there be limits on what the company charges?
COVID-19 revealed shortcomings in public health. Our data collection system has been disappointing. How can we improve our ability to respond to transmissible infections?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, learning lessons from the pandemic.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, scientists at Duke University and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill have collaborated on an important discovery. They identified an antibody that might help tame coronavirus infections. That includes both the original SARS virus that emerged in 2002, as well as the SARS-CoV-2 that causes COVID-19. The antibody might be used to prevent or treat current COVID infections. In addition, the scientists believe that this antibody could neutralize several other coronaviruses. There's even the possibility that this research could eventually lead to a universal, variant-proof coronavirus vaccine.
The type of fat in your diet is far more important than the amount, according to a new analysis of data from the Nurses' Health Study and the Health Professionals' Follow-Up Study. For decades, Americans were advised to follow a low-fat diet to reduce their risk of stroke. In this study, the scientists looked at how the risk of stroke changed with the amount and type of fat people were eating. Individuals who got most of their fat from vegetable sources like olive oil were 12% less likely to experience a stroke. On the other hand, those who consumed more than one serving of processed meat daily were 12% more likely to have a stroke during the 27 years of the study. Dairy fat had no impact on stroke risk. The data come from the 117,000 healthcare professionals who responded to detailed questionnaires about their diets and their health every few years.
Autoimmune disorders are common, affecting tens of millions of Americans. Such conditions include rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, lupus, and polymyalgia rheumatica. Now, results from a 5-year randomized controlled trial indicate that supplements of vitamin D and omega-3 fatty acids reduce the risk for developing autoimmune disease. There were more than 25,000 adults in the trial, designed primarily to study whether vitamin D or omega-3 supplements could lower the chance of heart disease or cancer. Analysis shows that people taking vitamin D3 for 5 years were about 22% less likely to get a diagnosis of an autoimmune disease. For omega-3 supplements, the drop in diagnosis was around 18%. Lead author Dr. Karen Kostenbader noted in reporting the study that there are no other known effective therapies to reduce the incidence of autoimmune diseases.
Proton pump inhibitors are among the most popular pills in the pharmacy. People take them for heartburn as well as to help heal ulcers. Doctors often prescribe PPIs such as omeprazole or lansoprazole to hospitalized patients to prevent something called stress ulcers. Data from nearly 10,000 Korean patients undergoing cardiac surgery suggests that could be risky. More than 5% of the patients who were taking PPIs prior to surgery developed acute kidney injury that necessitated dialysis during their hospitalization. In contrast, about 3% of those not taking PPIs experienced that type of kidney complication. Kidney-related deaths in the hospital were also higher among those taking PPIs. The authors suggest it would be prudent for people to stop taking their PPI before entering the hospital for cardiac surgery.
Tens of millions of Americans suffer from anxiety. That's in part because of COVID, but even before the pandemic, chronic anxiety was a problem. Swedish researchers report that either moderate or intense exercise can help alleviate symptoms of anxiety. 286 patients with anxiety syndrome were randomized to group exercise or a control group that got advice on physical activity. The study lasted 3 months. Group exercises were an hour at a time, 3 times a week. According to the researchers, the more people exercised, the better they felt. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. There are so many voices offering opinions about COVID-19 that it can be confusing. We try to make sure you have access to credible experts who can weigh the evidence objectively. What lessons should we be learning from this pandemic?
To find out, we turn to Dr. Eric Topol. He's the founder and director of the Scripps Research Translational Institute, professor of molecular medicine, and executive vice president of Scripps Research. Dr. Topol holds the Gary and Mary West Endowed Chair of Innovative Medicine at Scripps Research. His principal scientific focus has been on the genomic and digital tools to individualize medicine. Dr. Topol's most recent book is Deep Medicine: How Artificial Intelligence Can Make Healthcare Human Again.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Eric Topol.
So great to be with you again.
Dr. Topol, we have been talking to you, it must be for decades now, about a range of health topics. Initially, it was exclusively around cardiology, but then artificial intelligence and how it will change healthcare. You've been following and writing about COVID-19 since the very beginning of the pandemic. Where are we today?
Well, I wish we were in a state where the pandemic was fully behind us, but of course that's not the case. This Delta variant has posed a formidable challenge. And so while some countries have gotten very high vaccination rates and seem to be getting containment now, the United States clearly is not there yet. It's heading in the right direction, but there's a lot of wobble, and we already know that the UK has experienced an upward surge again. So it isn't clear. The hope is that we can get vaccination rates up and establish containment, but we're not there yet.
Well, Dr. Topol, it's not unusual for me to open my phone in the morning and see a tweet from Dr. Eric Topol right at the top of the list. You have written about the situation in the UK. They have a really quite good rate of vaccination, but the cases are rising. The hospitals are again under siege. What do you think is happening there?
Well, the high vaccination rate is not as high as you'd think in context. They're about 66%, which is 10 percent points almost better than the United States, but not nearly as high as places that are well over 80%. And there are many countries in that category. So part of the problem they're having is there's plenty of people still unvaccinated. They kind of hit a wall like the U.S. did, although it was at a higher plateau. But in addition to the problem of not having 85% or more people vaccinated, they also have the issues of waning. So like Israel, the UK and the U.S. share these early mover disadvantage. That is, they got started with aggressive campaigns of vaccination. And then because the waning occurs starting around 4 or 5 months and then really starting to get into serious waning after 6 months. There was a precipitous increase in infections, as you know, in Israel. And so the UK is experiencing that now. In addition to the waning and the lack of very high vaccination rates, they've got the teenagers where they have a low vaccination rate compared to many other countries in Europe. And they've also essentially gotten rid of masks and mitigation measures that certainly help. So this combination of various factors isn't helping matters, and we should learn from that.
Dr. Topol, we've been hearing about, and I'm sure you have the exact name right, but Delta Plus, another variant. It's kind of based on the Delta variant, but maybe more transmissible, which seems hard to believe. What are you hearing in the UK, and what do you predict for the future?
Right. Well, what we're talking about here, the Delta Plus is kind of the term that's been used, but there's so many Delta lineages, sublineages, that is the original Delta and then some further evolution of that strain of virus. This one, the real name of it right now at least, is AY.4.2. And that particular sequence of a Delta lineage has been found in about 10% of recent UK cases by sequencing. It's also been found in Israel and the US and India. It isn't clear yet whether it really is a competitor for Delta, the Delta proper, that is. You know, it's when you have spread, like is occurring in a pretty significant increase in the UK, it could just be a drag effect. That is, you know, there's a lot of spread, and some of it is this particular variant, this AY.4.2. So we don't know yet. There's some suggestion it could be a modest, like 10% increase over the original Delta strain, but it's too early to say. It doesn't appear to be at all an explanation for what's happening in the UK. We've already reviewed 4 other important factors, but we got to keep an eye on it. And certainly if this virus continues to evolve and we don't establish global containment, we're looking at potential further evolution of the virus for tougher forms to deal with than even Delta.
Now, it seems as if people all over the world are getting reluctant to adopt mitigation measures. You just mentioned that the UK, they're kind of getting tired of it. And we've seen it in Russia. We've seen it in Australia. There just seems to be a sentiment that we need to learn to live with COVID-19. Is that the only way forward? Just live with it?
Well, the endemic term is basically the future, that COVID-19 will be with us for many years ahead. But it would be better to get it contained. There's a lot of moving parts here. So, we're getting better medicines that can inactivate the virus, pills, that is, that are, only weeks away from getting formal, at least emergency authorization. And there'll be more of those to come. We're getting, obviously, boosters out there so that people don't get infected, which is, a real unknown what happens when you get a COVID infection. Not a guarantee that you won't have long COVID or won't have difficulties with it. So we do want to prevent these infections. We want to block the chain of transmission. We want to prevent long COVID, no less, of course, hospitalizations and deaths. So while we can live with it, we like to have it at the lowest level possible where it does the least amount of hurt. And we can do this, but we need to use masks and distancing and better ventilation, air filtration, all the measures that we know to help us get there. That we don't have people unnecessarily getting infections while we are getting in an even more powerful state to manage them. And, we're continuing to improve in that regard.
Dr. Topol, there is a huge amount of variability between countries as well as within the U.S. from one area to another in terms of the rates of disease cases that they have. So as we're talking right now, and this obviously is subject to change at less than a moment's notice, the UK and Russia, Romania, Germany, Georgia, the Netherlands are all seeing cases rise, whereas the Philippines, Malaysia, France, Brazil, Thailand, India, and Turkey, as well as the US, are looking at cases drop overall. Do we know how to account for this variability?
Well, one big factor is testing, and certain countries don't test very much. And of course, if you don't test very much, then you have to wind up looking at things like hospitalizations and COVID-related deaths. So that's one thing you have to normalize anytime you look at a country's case burden. But another issue, of course, is about the vaccination percent, the prior COVID rate. So, for example, Singapore just went through a pretty important surge for that country. And they had one of the top vaccination percents in the world, well over 80%. And that surge, which also was accompanied by the most hospitalizations and deaths they had incurred throughout the entire pandemic. But what's different in Singapore is they had managed it so well, like New Zealand and certain countries in the world that basically had close to a zero COVID state throughout the pandemic, that's what was part of the problem, is that this Delta strain is so remarkably hyper contagious that you need to have an immunity wall that's well over 95%. And so Singapore was sitting on two factors. One, that they didn't have that immunity wall of prior COVID. And secondly, they had waning. And so these booster shots, these third shots are particularly important. So this variability in countries, you have to start to look at testing, the rate of prior COVID, the vaccination rate of the entire population. You also, when you want to look at vaccination, you want to zoom in on the elderly, particularly because they are the highest risk. And the U.S. hasn't done nearly as well in people over the age of 65 and 75 as some other countries where it's almost 100%. So these are things that you have to not just look at the country case trajectory. There's many other things that you want to zoom in on.
You're listening to Dr. Eric Topol, founder and director of the Scripps Research Translational Institute. Dr. Topol is Executive Vice President of Scripps Research, Professor of Molecular Medicine, and holds the Gary and Mary West Endowed Chair of Innovative Medicine at Scripps Research. His principal scientific focus has been on the genomic and digital tools to individualize medicine. Dr. Topol's most recent book is Deep Medicine: How Artificial Intelligence Can Make Healthcare Human Again.
After the break, we discuss the controversy over vaccination versus natural immunity.
How important are boosters and who benefits the most?
Is it ethical to get a third shot when so many people in the world haven't yet had even one?
Why do vaccination rates elsewhere in the world matter to us in the U.S.?
We also discuss what the Merck drug molnupiravir could do for the pandemic.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. This podcast is made possible in part by CocoVia, maker of high-potency cocoa flavanol supplements. Cocoa flavanols are among the most well-studied plant-based nutrients, backed by 20 years of scientific research.
CocoVia Cardio Health is available in capsules or powder, providing 500 milligrams of cocoa flavanols daily. This supports better blood flow and vascular performance.
CocoVia also offers Memory Plus, a supplement with 750 milligrams of cocoa flavanols. This product is backed by 4 different clinical studies demonstrating significant improvement in several aspects of memory.
From now through November 20th, People's Pharmacy listeners can get 15% off any order at cocovia.com. Discount code PP CV Sale 15 is valid for single bulk or subscription orders of any CocoVia product. That's PP for People's Pharmacy, PPCV for CocoVia, Sale 15. PPCV Sale 15 at cocovia.com. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Kaya Biotics, organic probiotic products developed in Germany and made in the USA. KAYA Biotics.com.
Also by CocoVia, offering its cardio health product with 500 milligrams of cocoflavanols in powder and capsule form. More information at cocovia.com.
Today, we are talking about COVID-19 vaccinations and treatments. What's the story on Merck's new drug, Molnupiravir?
Our guest is Dr. Eric Topol, founder and director of the Scripps Research Translational Institute. He's professor of molecular medicine and executive vice president of Scripps Research. Dr. Topol holds the Gary and Mary West Endowed Chair of Innovative Medicine at Scripps Research. He was elected to the National Academy of Medicine and is one of the top 10 most cited researchers in medicine. His principal scientific focus is genomic and digital tools to individualize medicine. Dr. Topol has written a number of books, including Deep Medicine, How Artificial Intelligence Can Make Healthcare Human Again.
Dr. Topol, there is a brewing controversy about the benefit of vaccination versus the benefit of natural immunity. And I guess what I don't completely understand is why people are actually promoting the concept of natural immunity, because it seems like that is risky business.
Exactly. Well, I have a real problem with this term natural immunity because it isn't natural to get COVID, right? You don't want that. Unfortunately, it's had rampant spread throughout the world and especially in the United States. But the idea that you do, if you had the misfortune of getting COVID, there's a variable immune response. Some people, even when they have mild or no symptoms, develop a very strong antibody and cellular immune response. And then other people, even if they wound up being hospitalized in the intensive care unit, their residual immune response isn't that strong. So it's highly unpredictable, just like the clinical scenario of loss of smell and taste and potentially even, developing pneumonia. These features are so heterogeneous. So natural immunity, I prefer the term prior COVID. Some people will use the term COVID survivors to denote that you could die from COVID. And the risk of that, of course, increase particularly are partitioned by higher age groups. But the real issue here is that if you've had prior COVID, it does provide some immune response that's worth something. And it really looks to be comparable to one dose of a vaccine. And as you know, one dose of vaccine is not enough. You need to have 2 doses. That's true for all vaccines. And in fact, 3 doses if you're in a high-risk group. So that's the issue here, is that people with prior COVID, or what some people like to refer to as natural immunity, even though it's particularly unnatural, they should, in their vaccination cards, which of course shouldn't be cards, they should be digital and it should be not something that could be easily faked, but they should get credit for 1 dose. And so if you had prior COVID, you only really need 1 dose of a vaccine. And unless we prove otherwise, the extra booster shots may indeed be unnecessary. Now, there's one other point to make here, and that is that this is a chance for people to be superhuman immunity. Prior COVID plus a vaccine, so-called hybrid immunity, gives the most protection over any combination of vaccines. That's 2 doses of Moderna or Pfizer or J&J or whatever doses and combinations of vaccines you want, you cannot get as good an immune response as this hybrid immunity of prior COVID and a vaccine. So if you want to have superhuman immunity, you don't go out and get COVID, but if you've had it, get a vaccine, darn it, you're going to really benefit. And that's something that not enough people are doing.
Now, Dr. Topol, can we talk a bit about boosters? I'm wondering, how important are they and who benefits the most?
Well, the only data that we have so far is from Israel. What I mean there is we've got some data for immune response that, kick up your neutralizing antibodies and cellular immunity T cells. But the only real clinical data we have is from Israel, where they've given many millions of people, starting at higher age groups and then dropping down, boosters and followed them. That is 3rd shots of Pfizer, which is where the only real data lies. We don't really have that kind of data from Moderna or J&J. But what we see from the Israeli data, which was presented at the FDA, and much of it has been published in the New England Journal now, is that if you're over age 60, and now more recently over age 40, if you get a 3rd shot, that is your past 6 months, you get a 3rd shot, you get back that very high efficacy, 95%, or a 20-fold increase in protection from severe disease, which the Israelis define as a drop in oxygen saturation in the blood, which reflects lung involvement, serious symptoms, or hospitalization, severe disease as they define it. So that's the rationale for people to get boosters. Now, because that data is just for Pfizer, and in fact, even down to age 20 for symptomatic infection protection, that is restoring the extremely high efficacy of 90+%, 95%. So the only questions that are now remaining are where do you draw the line? What do you do about the other vaccines? How long is this going to last, this booster? So we don't have all these questions resolved yet. But for sure, if you're over age 60, you should be getting a 3rd shot if you've had Pfizer. And certainly the data are indicative that's the case for Moderna as well.
Dr. Topol, some of the people who have been discussing boosters have said it's unethical for Americans who are, at least for those who are under 65 or maybe 75, to use up vaccine, getting boosters when so many of the countries in the rest of the world have not yet had a chance to get even a first dose of vaccine to their populations. Why does it matter to the U.S. what the rest of the world is doing with vaccination?
Right. Well, I'm very sensitive to the importance, the primacy, as I've already mentioned, about global containment of the virus. And we're not going to get there until we have the world population pushing 8 billion people, with the vast majority of them getting vaccinated, fully vaccinated. But the issue there is that requires billions of vaccines, somewhere like 15 billion vaccines. And so those are in process. We need to move much faster. But at the same time, it's a false dichotomy to say that we should leave people in the lurch and let them be exposed to serious infections and severe disease. We shouldn't do that. That it was always conceived that these vaccines were going to need a booster. The only question was it at year 1 to year 2? How long could we go? But we never thought that 2 shots, particularly when they're given 3 weeks or 4 weeks apart, was going to hold people for the duration of COVID exposure. So it turned out 6 months really was the break point. Now, in addition, for the U.S. consideration, something that's not really been discussed, we've only given vaccinations to 57% of our people. That is the 2 doses. So we haven't done a good job at all in getting vaccines to our population. Imagine if we had done as we could have led the world with 90% of our population vaccinated. So we have done a very poor utilization of vaccines in this country. at least we can get the darn people who did get vaccinated to keep their protection, particularly when they're at high risk. So I don't see it as either or. I see it as we need to do both.
What are your thoughts about an oral antiviral? There seems to be a lot of excitement right now about molnupiravir. At the time we're speaking with you, it has not yet received emergency use authorization from the Food and Drug Administration. Do you see this as the way out of the pandemic?
Well, it has a lot of potential. I call it the MPAC because it's hard to say that word that you did so well. But the point here is it's 4 pills twice a day for 5 days. But what's distressing is they charged the U.S. government over $700 per dose when the government bought millions of doses. So its expense is not good. And it certainly is one issue that's sticky. The other, of course, is we haven't seen the data, only the press release that it reduced hospitalizations or death by 50%. And in fact, the rate was very high, much higher in the control group, the placebo group, than in the studies that gave monoclonal antibody combinations like Regeneron. So we need to see all the data that is being submitted and reviewed by the FDA. Ultimately, hopefully the medical community will see it. But it does have a lot of promise. The reason it has promise is right now, and there's also a trial, I should say, for just people being exposed, not just early into their infection. The promise here is that we could, with a pill for 5 days, really gain far better control than what we can with these intravenous infusions or injections under the skin, which are even more expensive and hard to come by. So this can be made at scale. It can be hopefully much less expensive and readily available. Ideally, it would be broadly distributed. And so, this is a big potential. And not only that, it's not the only pill. There's also other companies that are very close to having their results being announced. So there's going to be multiple antiviral pills that we haven't had until, the weeks ahead. That actually is really exciting, pending review of the data.
And I think also we do need to talk about the cost. After all, molnupiravir was developed in part with federal money. So should the company really get away with charging the federal government that much money per dose?
I think it's preposterous. I don't see any justification for over $700 for these 40 pills per dose per person. The estimated cost, maximum cost, is $20 to make it, and already there are copies of this drug in India that are even less expensive than that are becoming available. So the amount of gouging the public, the profit here, is distressing to me. And you would think in the midst of a pandemic, and this is Merck, which has had its issues in the past, as you remember when we discussed Vioxx many years ago together. Mm-hmm. This would be an opportunity for Merck to do the right thing and not charge over $700 for some pills that they can make for a piddly amount. So it's to me, it's galling. And I don't understand it. I don't understand why the public has to be taken advantage of when they could become heroes, and instead, at least in my view, they're goats.
Well, and once upon a time, Merck actually was a hero in developing a drug that is now extremely controversial in the context of the pandemic, but was not at all controversial when they developed it, ivermectin, an antiparasitic drug, which they provided at cost to countries.
They provided it for free.
They provided it for free to countries that were beset by river blindness, onchocerciasis. Mm-hmm. And that was an extremely ethical move, but you can't rest on your laurels, can you?
Well, I applaud them for that, and I wish they would come in with this drug, this MPAC, at a very nominal cost. And what's going to happen is it'll be far less expensive in the rest of the countries in the world than it will be in the U.S. That's characteristic of pharma. And that doesn't compute either. So this is the big chance for them to do it right, but they've already tapped the government for the over $700 per dose amount, and that is not a good harbinger of where we're headed.
Well, I don't want to harp on cost, but I can't help remembering, because I had polio as a child, the Salk and the Sabin vaccine. And I mean, here was an extraordinary breakthrough in modern medicine. And to my knowledge, neither of those incredible researchers profited from their discovery. And even the companies that developed those vaccines didn't make a windfall. And yet here in this country, in this time, the COVID vaccines have brought in billions to the companies.
Right.
What happened?
Well, you're right on there with critique. And the profit motive is overridden the idea that this is a humanitarian existential crisis. I mean, it's really amazing. Many billionaires have been created from the vaccines. And certainly these companies could do better to make these vaccines available. We talked earlier about global equity. And in Africa, we're still dealing with vaccinations and, low single-digit % of the African population. They're the outlier of the world. And you don't see these companies stepping up to provide vaccines for free. So, it's really unfortunate. Here again, the government has to buy them, the U.S. government, and then donate them. And so this is the way it's progressing. It's really unfortunate that there's not more goodwill that we're seeing among all these companies that are active in promoting their vaccines or drugs during the pandemic.
You're listening to Dr. Eric Topol, founder and director of the Scripps Research Translational Institute. He's also professor of molecular medicine and executive vice president of Scripps Research. Dr. Topol holds the Gary and Mary West Endowed Chair of Innovative Medicine at Scripps Research. As a researcher, he has published over 1,200 peer-reviewed articles and is one of the top 10 most cited researchers in medicine. His principal scientific focus has been genomic and digital tools to individualize medicine. Dr. Topol is the author of several books, including his most recent, Deep Medicine: How Artificial Intelligence Can Make Healthcare Human Again.
After the interview, we asked Dr. Topol about the antiviral pills from Pfizer as well as Merck. He said they're a major step forward, adding to the power of vaccines. The Pfizer pill, which was the fastest new chemical entity to get through clinical trials in medical history, has the potential advantage over molnupiravir of not inducing mutations. Eventually, he anticipates that the pills could be used for prevention of COVID-19 in people exposed to the infection. But first, we'll need clinical trials demonstrating effectiveness for that purpose.
After the break, we'll find out why we're still relying on technology from the 1918 flu pandemic, masks, and distance.
Are there technological advances that could save us?
Why are we so far behind the curve when it comes to data collection and analysis, like wastewater testing?
How can we prepare for another pandemic so we don't get caught by surprise again?
We'll also look at how we could strengthen our public health system.
Will the burnout healthcare workers are experiencing make that too hard?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
This podcast is brought to you in part by Kaya Biotics, organic probiotic supplements. These supplements are made in the USA with high-quality, sustainably sourced ingredients.
Originally developed in Germany, Kaya Biotics offers 3 different formulations with 15 carefully selected strains of bacteria. These are designed to increase the diversity of your gut flora and support your immune system. More information at KAYABiotics.com.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by CocoVia, now offering its Cardio Health Powder with 500 milligrams of cocoa flavanols. More information at cocovia.com.
And by Kaya Biotics, micro-encapsulated organic hypoallergenic probiotic products developed in Germany and made in the U.S. KAYABiotics.com.
We are talking about pandemic priorities. To figure out what works and what doesn't, we need excellent data. Why haven't public health authorities taken their data collection and analysis to the next level?
Our guest is Dr. Eric Topol, founder and director of the Scripps Research Translational Institute. He's professor of molecular medicine and executive vice president of Scripps Research. He holds the Gary and Mary West Endowed Chair of Innovative Medicine at Scripps Research. As a researcher, he has published over 1,200 peer-reviewed articles, and he's one of the 10 most cited researchers in medicine. Dr. Topol is the author of several books. His most recent is Deep Medicine: How Artificial Intelligence Can Make Healthcare Human Again.
Dr. Topol, you have written a lot about artificial intelligence, technology, and I think a lot of people think that technology is the answer to everything when it comes to healthcare. and yet here we have reverted back to some of the same strategies that were used during the 1918 pandemic with influenza: masks, hygiene,
distance.
I mean, exactly. Is technology going to save us, or do we need to celebrate public health and perhaps invest more aggressively in that aspect of our healthcare system?
Well, it's never one or the other, of course. We still need the public health measures, and certainly things like masks and physical distancing are really important. And before we had vaccines, it was all we had. But the question is, can artificial intelligence help if we're going to get into the AI specter? And there has been some evidence of that. So not anywhere near what was envisioned, perhaps. But for one, there's a very important report that came published in the journal Nature in recent weeks in Greece. And there they used AI to help screen people coming into the country to pick up the potential for asymptomatic carriers. And it turned out to be extraordinarily effective. And it's something that probably should be used all over the world as people flying into countries are being screened, because you can't test everyone. So they developed, algorithms for who would be the most likely potential carriers of COVID. Another use of AI during the pandemic was the finding of a medication that had activity against this virus, a so-called JAK kinase inhibitor, baricitinib. And that drug ultimately was shown to reduce mortality in people who were hospitalized with COVID. Initially, it was approved in combination with remdesivir, and then later alone through emergency authorization. So we've seen a couple of glimpses of where AI can help, but we haven't had technology, that is information technology, create a very favorable situation to prevail in the pandemic. We can't depend on it, obviously. The hope is that, for example, we haven't done a good job with influenza. And in fact, the flu vaccines their efficacy is 40%, 50% at best on a good year. Whereas, the COVID vaccines are as high as 95%. And so the question is, can we use AI to predict the language of the virus and learn so that we can each year update the flu vaccine to where the virus is evolving rather than giving the same darn vaccines where the strain has changed. And the same thing for COVID. Now we're at a position where we don't know where COVID's going to evolve. Can we use AI with the sequence of the virus so well known and up to date? Can we then predict where it's headed, where it goes beyond Delta? And there's many other ways that AI can be used in this pandemic setting. The one that I'm particularly enamored by is the idea of having individualized risk assessment. So when you look on your smartphone, it would give you all the layers of data that you need to know about your instantaneous risk. So it would have things like the mobility in your region, the number of new infections, the genomic sequencing of the virus in your region, the people having sensors, what is their COVID pickup in terms of their resting heart rate elevated in your neighborhood, and on, all the different layers, including things like wastewater surveillance, which is really important that we're not doing enough of. So that would be the ultimate. If we do that and we are trying to manage in the endemic state of COVID-19, I do think AI can make a really great contribution. But nowhere in the world has anyone done that yet.
Yeah, I've been really disappointed, to be honest with you, with the CDC and WHO. It seems like there have been a lot of missteps. I mean, forget for a moment about, whether or not it's airborne, and there are aerosol problems and masks and 6 feet, all of the mistakes that were made. But it seems like we're missing a lot of data. I mean, you mentioned, Israel has the most data when it comes to the Pfizer vaccine. Well, why aren't we collecting that kind of data in the U.S.? Why don't we have it all over the world? Why are we still kind of behind the 8 ball when it comes to the wastewater analysis? It seems like there's a lot of opportunity going forward.
And Dr. Tobel, while we're talking about wastewater, would you please explain what is wastewater surveillance and how does it work?
Sure. Well, that's a quick one because, all the municipalities have their wastewater that they can, some of them do, a very limited number, do screening for the levels of the COVID virus and can even do sequencing to see if it's changing, if it's evolving in any significant way. So that should be done routinely in every municipality throughout the entire United States, but it's only done in a spot way. And it's highly helpful for predicting if another outbreak is going to happen days before, perhaps even up to a week before. And it has been used in many countries around the world very successfully. So that's one thing. But, I think what you got at was the issue of the pathetic state of data capture and presentation in the United States. And I have had discussions with the CDC and the HHS, which have been very frustrating. I've written, op-eds about this. We should have all the data. For example, we had for many weeks more than 100,000 people in the United States hospitalized for COVID during the Delta wave. We should have known every single one of those people, did they get vaccinated, when they got vaccinated, what vaccine they got, how old are they, what other coexisting conditions do they have, and on and on. Then we would have diagnosed right on the spot about waning, about which vaccines, about which people. But no, we had to rely on data from another country, namely Israel, and they don't have data from Moderna or J&J, for example. Plus, we are a country of 330 million people. They are a country at Israel of 9 million people. We're much more diverse. It is absolutely inexcusable, the lack of data that we have in this country. For the wealth of this country, its technical information system capability, there is no excuse. And when I discussed this with the HHS, they said they're going to try and do better, but they haven't really done better. Every single person hospitalized, when they said in May they weren't going to follow breakthrough infections anymore, but they would report on hospitalizations and deaths, they haven't even done that, which is the basal de minimis issue. So it's very upsetting, and we are flying blind in this pandemic, and this has been going on for over 20 months. It's really pathetic.
Well, I share your outrage and I appreciate your passion. And I guess that takes me to where do we go from here? I mean, have we learned anything from the last year and a half, 2 years in this pandemic? And how the heck are we going to prepare for another pandemic, whether it's a year from now, a decade from now, or 100 years from now?
Well, if we don't get our data captured right, which should be the easiest thing to fix, we're not going to be prepared for any pandemic. And so that is square number one. And by the way, in all the announcements that the president and the White House have made about what we're doing to deal with COVID, not a single one has addressed this data issue, which is more telling that we're not ready. But pandemic readiness, to me, besides the data, the biggest thing we're not doing is prioritizing a vaccine against the entire SARS-CoV virus family. So instead of the vaccine we have now, which is still directed to the original Wuhan strain, we should be making a vaccine that will take down any SARS-CoV virus, that is, any variant that continues in the evolution of SARS-CoV-2. Why isn't that a national priority? Because we know this virus will continue to evolve, especially since we don't have it contained worldwide, no less in the United States. So the fact that we haven't done this when it's eminently doable, we have research teams like my colleagues at Scripps Research and many others around the country and the world that are working on this in a siloed way. We should be coordinated globally, and we should be producing as quickly as we can an effective and safe pan-coronavirus vaccine. And also, we should stockpiling such vaccines directed against the other major virus families that we know could cause trouble in the future, be it influenza or Nipah or others that are likely to be incriminated in that regard. So we're just not doing things that we should be doing and making them a priority.
Dr. Topol, I want to ask about something that's a little bit less technological, but still, I think, pretty important, and that's public health. How can we strengthen public health? When the pandemic hit and we suddenly realized, although we should have, one could argue, seen it coming, it did come at us without a lot of stealth. When the pandemic hit, we were completely unprepared to do, for example, contact tracing, which is basic to containing infectious disease outbreak. Now, after months and months and more than a year of this pandemic, the public health departments around the country have been hollowed out. The hostility to public health has led people to leave their jobs. Is there anything we can do to restore the strength of public health?
Right. Well, that's another dimension to the problem that we have, that is the messengers to try to impose masks and distancing and all the right moves have been attacked. And this has been a vicious attack in many parts of the country. It's just unthinkable that this has been occurring. Our first problem wasn't actually contact tracing. What got us into a deep hole, which we've never been able to dig out of, was not even having testing for COVID for 2 months, the first 2 months of the pandemic, because of abject failures at the CDC and FDA, which was not at all seen in the rest of the world, where they used the WHO testing or other suitable testing to get on top of COVID. So we were behind the 8 ball right from the get-go. You can't really do contact tracing if you don't have any tests, right? So we never got the contact tracing right either, but still the testing is woefully inadequate. The UK and Israel do 4 to 5 times as much testing on a daily basis per capita than we do. And so many other countries do as well. So here, again, this what was a rich, great country that could lead the way and had a high respect titer for its public health capabilities, has shown its inability to execute And so, yeah, public health, you need people to do contact tracing. Obviously, there is technologic solutions for that as well. But we haven't done that either. We're really not doing the basic, kind of 101 of public health when it comes to a pandemic. And I hope that can be changed. A part of this, though, is the divisive nature of our country, how so much of the pandemic has been politicized. Everything from masks to medicines that don't work, like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin for COVID, or vaccines. So this is the basis, the divisiveness of the country. You don't see that, for example, in our northern neighbor in Canada, where pretty much almost everyone is working on the same mission against the virus, not each other. And so this attack, this ad hominem stuff against the public health people is part of an outgrowth of this divisiveness in this country, which cannot go on. It cannot be tolerated.
Moving on to another topic, we're almost out of time. The impact of COVID on the U.S. healthcare system, it seems like there's an incredible amount of burnout in our hospitals and our ICUs, particularly for our nurses, for our doctors. Are we going to be able to dig ourselves out?
Now, the other question, which is, how do we get out of this? We have the tools. We have all the ways to get COVID largely in our rear view mirror, but we're not executing in this country. We could have led the world of how to do this. And instead, we're ranked number 52 of the countries in vaccination right now, and we are continuing to drop. And we've had this problem of politics and divisiveness are holding us back. And we don't have this common enemy of the virus being the main strategy, where we know the tools and we're increasing the armamentarium all the time. So I don't know what it's going to take to have unity and directed and all of our energy and resources properly. But I never lose hope because I'm actually a very optimistic person.
Dr. Eric Topol, it's always a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me again.
You've been listening to Dr. Eric Topol. He's the founder and director of the Scripps Research Translational Institute and professor of molecular medicine. Dr. Topol is also executive vice president of Scripps Research, where he holds the Gary and Mary West Endowed Chair of Innovative Medicine. He wrote Deep Medicine, How Artificial Intelligence Can Make Healthcare Human Again.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews. B.J. Liederman composed our theme music.
This show is a co-production of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC, with the People's Pharmacy.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Cocoa Via, the maker of high-potency cocoflavanol supplements that support cognitive and cardiovascular health. More information at cocovia.com.
Also by Kaya Biotics, microencapsulated organic hypoallergenic probiotic products, developed in Germany and made in the U.S. KAYABiotics.com.
Today's show is number 1280. You can find it online at peoplespharmacy.com. You can subscribe to our podcast through your favorite podcast provider. We post the show on our website on Monday morning.
If you'd like to add a comment about the show, look for the post on the website and enter your comment at the bottom of the show notes for number 1280. It's under the podcast tab.
At peoplespharmacy.com, you can sign up for our free online newsletter to get the latest news about COVID-19 and other important health stories. By subscribing to our newsletter, you'll also have regular access to our weekly podcast and find out ahead of time which topics we'll be covering. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening. Please join us again next week. Thank you for listening to the People's Pharmacy Podcast. It's an honor and a pleasure to bring you our award-winning program week in and week out. But producing and distributing this show as a free podcast takes time
and costs money.
If you like what we do and you'd like to help us continue to produce high-quality, independent healthcare journalism, please consider chipping in.
All you have to do is go to peoplespharmacy.com/donate.
Whether it's just one time or a monthly donation, you can be part of the team that makes this show possible. Thank you for your continued loyalty and support. We couldn't make our show without you.